What does it truly mean to be loyal? Not the everyday loyalty of keeping a promise or showing up for a friend, but the kind of loyalty that defies reason, the kind that stares down death itself without flinching. Picture this, a lone warrior standing between his king and an army of enemies, knowing his next breath might be his last, or a whispered secret carried to the grave by a courtier who chose torture over betrayal. These aren't just scenes from an epic film, they're real moments from history, where loyalty wasn't just a choice but a force that shaped empires. Welcome to a journey through 25 of the most extraordinary acts of devotion ever recorded, where the stakes were life and death, and the rewards were often nothing more than honor itself. Think about the last time someone stood by you when it wasn't easy. Now multiply that by 1,000, and you might come close to understanding the sacrifices we're about to explore. From the shadowed halls of ancient courts to the blood-soaked battlefields where bodyguards became legends, these stories reveal a truth we often forget. Loyalty isn't passive. It's a fire that burns brightest in the darkest moments. Take the Persian immortals, an elite force who fought to the last man to protect their king, or the Byzantine eunuchs who wielded influence not for power but to shield their emperors from treachery. These weren't just soldiers or servants, they were human shields, living and dying by a code that modern minds struggle to fathom. But why do these tales still matter today? Because beneath the armor and the ancient languages, these were people like us, flesh and blood, fear and courage. Their choices echo through time, reminding us that loyalty isn't about blind obedience. It's about recognizing something greater than yourself and saying, "This is worth protecting." As we unravel these 25 acts, some celebrated, others nearly forgotten, you'll discover cunning escapes, last stands that defied the odds, and quiet sacrifices that changed the course of history. This isn't just a list, it's a testament to the power of devotion. So let's step into the past together, where every decision carried weight, and loyalty was the sharpest weapon of all. The story of the 300 Spartans at Thermopyli isn't just about numbers. It's about what happens when loyalty transforms ordinary men into legends. Picture the narrow pass, cliffs on one side, the sea on the other, and a force of thousands bearing down. King Leonidas didn't just choose to stand his ground, he chose who would stand with him. These weren't recruits or conscripts, they were warriors who had trained together, fought together, and now faced death together. Herodotus tells us they fought not just with spears and shields, but with something far more powerful, an unbreakable bond. When the Persian king Xerxes demanded their weapons, Leonidas famously replied, "Come and take them." That defiance wasn't just bravery, it was loyalty in its purest form, a refusal to betray their way of life even when the odds were impossible. What's often forgotten is that those 300 weren't alone. 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans stood with them, yet history remembers the Spartans most vividly. Why? Because their sacrifice wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. They knew they wouldn't survive, yet they held the line for 3 days, buying critical time for the rest of Greece to rally. Their loyalty wasn't to a single king or city, but to an idea. That freedom was worth dying for. Modern scholars debate the exact numbers, but the impact is undeniable. Thermopyli became a rallying cry, proof that a handful of devoted warriors could shake an empire. The brilliance of their loyalty lay in its simplicity. No grand speeches, no complex oaths, just a shared understanding that some things matter more than survival. When the Spartans' weapons shattered, they fought with their hands. When their strength failed, they fought on their knees. even in death, they were found facing the enemy, their bodies forming a final barrier. That's the legacy of Thermopyli. Loyalty isn't measured in victories, but in the willingness to stand when others would flee. And as we'll see next, that same spirit would later ignite the heart of a single Roman soldier, whose choice in a moment of crisis would change the course of history. The Praetorian Guard didn't just protect the Roman emperor, they embodied a loyalty so fierce it could rewrite history. Picture the gleaming armor, the silent vigilance, the unspoken understanding that their lives meant nothing if the emperor fell. Among these elite warriors stood Cassius Chaerea, a man whose name would become synonymous with vengeance in the name of duty. When Emperor Caligula, a ruler known for his cruelty, was assassinated in a conspiracy of senators and disgruntled officials, it was Chaerea who turned grief into action. While others might have seized the moment for personal gain, he hunted down the conspirators with relentless precision, not for power but for justice. His loyalty wasn't to a title or a throne, it was to the sacred oath he'd sworn, a promise that outlived the man he'd pledged to protect. But the Praetorians' devotion wasn't just about brute force. Their discipline was legendary, their training honed to perfection. They didn't merely stand guard, they became extensions of the emperor's will, moving as one unit in a dance of deadly efficiency. Ancient historians like Tacitus marveled at their ability to maintain order in a city teeming with chaos, their presence alone enough to deter would-be traitors. Yet this same loyalty could twist into a paradox. When the line between protector and kingmaker blurred, some Praetorians discovered the dark temptation of playing kingmaker, backing claimants to the throne in exchange for favors. The very strength that made them indispensable also made them dangerous, a lesson Rome learned too well in its turbulent history. What set the Praetorians apart wasn't just their skill, but their symbolism. They weren't merely soldiers, they were living shields, human reminders that loyalty could be both a weapon and a shield. In an empire where betrayal lurked in every shadow, their steadfastness became a rare constant. Even as emperors rose and fell, the idea of the Praetorian Oath endured a beacon of devotion in a world where power often corrupted. And as we'll soon see, that same unyielding spirit would echo centuries later in the East, where a single samurai's loyalty would defy reason and redefine honor. Buried beneath the earth for over 2,000 years, the terracotta warriors of Emperor Kinshi Huang stand as one of history's most astonishing monuments to loyalty. Not stone or myth, but clay and intent, each of the 8,000 soldiers crafted with unique faces, armor, and postures, frozen in time to serve their emperor beyond death itself. Imagine the sheer scale of this devotion, an entire army painstakingly sculpted and arranged in battle formation, not for conquest or glory, but for a silent, eternal watch. This wasn't just a funeral rite, it was a declaration that loyalty could transcend even the boundaries of life. The irony is haunting. While Kinshi Huang sought immortality through potions and elixirs, his real legacy became these silent guardians. Recent archaeological discoveries reveal even more depth pits filled with terracotta bureaucrats, musicians, and acrobats, a mirror of his court meant to accompany him into eternity. The level of detail is staggering, arrows still tipped with bronze, chariots with functional parts, even the soles of the warriors' shoes textured for grip. Every element whispers the same message, service without end. But here's what chills the spine. Many of these statues were based on real soldiers. These weren't anonymous faces. They were likely portraits of the living, men who had pledged their lives to the emperor and now, in effigy, fulfilled that promise forever. What does such a sacrifice tell us about the power of belief? Kin's subjects didn't just obey him. They internalized his vision so completely that their likenesses became part of his afterlife arsenal. Modern excavations continue to uncover secret traces of pigment, hinting at once vibrant uniforms, weapons still sharp enough to draw blood, even evidence of workshops where artisans toiled for decades. This wasn't mere superstition, it was a cultural conviction that loyalty could conquer death. And while we might dismiss it as ancient pageantry, the underlying truth resonates. When people believe in something greater than themselves, they'll build monuments or armies to prove it. Now, shift the scene from China's silent clay sentinels to the roaring longships of the north, where loyalty wasn't etched in pottery but forged in fire and blood. When a Viking Jarl named Sigurd the Stout faced betrayal, his housecarls didn't just defend him, they rewrote the rules of devotion in ways that would echo through the sagas. There's a moment in the Icelandic sagas where the line between man and myth blurs, where loyalty becomes something wild, untamed, and terrifying. The berserkers of the Viking Age didn't just fight for their chieftains, they surrendered themselves to a frenzy so complete it defied reason. Picture a warrior foaming at the mouth, his eyes rolling back, his body convulsing not from fear but from something deeper, an oath that bound him to his lord beyond pain, beyond death. One saga recounts how a lone berserker named Skallagrim stood on a narrow bridge, his axe dripping with blood, his roar shaking the trees as he held back an entire army to buy his chieftain's escape. He wasn't just fighting, he was a storm made flesh. What drove these men to such extremes? Their loyalty wasn't just sworn, it was etched into their bones through rituals older than memory. Before battle, some drank hallucinogenic brews or wore pelts of bears and wolves, not as disguises but as transformations. They believed they channeled the spirits of these beasts, becoming something more or less than human. Historians debate whether their trances were chemical, psychological, or something beyond both, but the result was the same. A warrior who felt no wounds, no fatigue, only the pulse of his oath. And here's the chilling truth: many berserkers didn't survive their own loyalty. Their bodies, pushed beyond limits, often collapsed after battle, their hearts giving out from the strain. Yet their legacy wasn't just brutality. The berserker's oath was a double-edged sword, revered and feared even by their own people. While their ferocity won battles, their uncontrollable rage could turn on allies. Some sagas tell of berserkers who had to be restrained after victory, their fury still burning like a fire with no fuel. This wasn't blind obedience, it was a covenant. In exchange for absolute devotion, chieftains granted them land, status, and a place in the songs that would outlive them. The berserker didn't just die for his lord, he lived for him, every breath a testament to a bond stronger than fear. Now take that same unyielding spirit across the world to feudal Japan, where loyalty wasn't just sworn in blood but sealed in silence. When a samurai named Kusunoki Masashige faced impossible odds, his choice would redefine what it meant to serve. The tale of the 47 Ronin isn't just a story of revenge, it's a masterclass in the art of waiting. Imagine spending 2 years pretending to be drunkards, beggars, and fools, all while hiding swords beneath tattered robes. These weren't just samurai, they were actors in a slow-burning play where every move was calculated to restore what mattered most: honor. When their lord, Asano Naganori, was forced to commit seppuku after attacking a corrupt official, his retainers faced an impossible choice. They could accept disgrace or they could bide their time, knowing their vengeance would cost them everything. What makes their loyalty so extraordinary isn't the bloodshed, it's the restraint. The Ronin could have charged into battle immediately, dying in a blaze of glory. Instead, their leader, Oishi Kuranosuke, orchestrated something far more profound. He let the world believe they had given up, even divorcing his wife and frequenting brothels to sell the lie. Meanwhile, spies tracked their target, Kira Yoshinoka, mapping his routines down to the minute. When they finally struck on a snowy night in January 1703, it wasn't a frenzied attack, it was a surgical operation. They subdued Kira's guards without killing them, offering him the very chance to die with dignity that their master had been denied. The aftermath reveals the true weight of their choice. By law, the Ronin had committed a capital offense, yet their discipline and adherence to Bushido, the samurai code, turned public opinion in their favor. Even the shogun, though forced to sentence them to death, allowed them the honor of seppuku rather than execution. Their graves at Sengakuji Temple became a pilgrimage site where people still burn incense today. But here's the haunting question: was their loyalty to Asano or to the idea of justice itself? The 47 didn't just avenge a man, they exposed a system that had failed him, proving that true devotion could outmaneuver even the most powerful corruption. Now shift the scene from Edo-era Japan to the frostbitten halls of medieval England, where a knight's loyalty would face the ultimate test not against enemies, but against his own king. When Henry II's fury turned on Thomas Becket, one man stood between the crown and the church, and his choice would echo through history. Sir William Marshall's story begins with a betrayal that would break most men yet forge the very loyalty that made him legendary. At just 5 years old, his own father handed him over as a hostage to King Stephen during a siege, declaring he'd rather lose his son than his castle. The king, expecting the boy's execution, found himself disarmed when William's father famously retorted, "I still have the hammer and the anvil to forge more sons." But instead of bitterness, young William absorbed a different lesson. Survival demanded more than strength. It required the grace to serve even those who'd wronged you. By the time he stood at Richard the Lionheart's side decades later, that lesson had crystallized into an unshakable code. Exile tested Marshall's loyalty like nothing else. When Richard's brother John, the same man who'd later become the villain of Robin Hood lore, tried to seize the throne in Richard's absence, William faced an impossible choice. Power lay with John, honor lay with the absent Lionheart. While others switched sides for land or gold, Marshall held fast, defending Richard's interests even as John's forces burned his estates and branded him a traitor. Chroniclers recount how he once single-handedly held a bridge against 100 knights to buy time for Richard's allies, his armor so dented afterward that servants had to peel it off like a crushed tin. This wasn't blind allegiance, it was loyalty refined through fire, a conscious choice to stand by the rightful king even when the cost was ruin. What set Marshall apart wasn't just his sword arm, it was his political cunning. During Richard's captivity in Austria, when half of Europe saw a chance to extort the kingdom, William became the Lionheart's shadow diplomat. He negotiated with pirates for safe passage, smuggled gold through enemy lines, and even outmaneuvered the Holy Roman Emperor himself. Yet his greatest act came after Richard's death, when he protected the boy King Henry III with the same fervor he'd shown the Lionheart. At 70 years old, he led charges in full armor, his very presence on the battlefield enough to turn the tide. By then, he'd earned a title no other knight would ever hold, the greatest knight who ever lived. But here's the paradox: Marshall's loyalty wasn't to crowns or thrones, but to the idea of kingship itself. He served flawed men because he believed in the stability they represented, a lesson carved into him during those childhood years as a hostage. His life answers a haunting question: can loyalty coexist with clear-eyed recognition of a leader's faults? The Marshal's legacy shouts yes. When Richard's recklessness endangered the kingdom, William didn't flatter, he advised. When John's cruelty threatened civil war, he didn't obey, he negotiated. True loyalty, his story teaches, isn't submission. It's the courage to hold a leader to their highest self, even when they falter. Now, turn the page from knights and battlefields to the whispered intrigues of a queen's chambers, where a very different kind of loyalty played out in silks and ciphers. While men like Marshall wielded swords, Elizabeth I's spymaster Francis Walsingham wielded something far subtler: information, and his devotion to his queen would rewrite the rules of shadow warfare. Hatshepsut's reign should have been impossible. A woman ruling as pharaoh in 15th century BC Egypt, a world where power was carved in the image of men, yet she didn't just survive, she flourished. Behind her golden pectorals and ceremonial beard lay a secret weapon more potent than any army: the silent, unwavering loyalty of her inner circle. Chief among them was Senenmut, a vizier whose devotion transcended duty. While other pharaohs built monuments to their own glory, Senenmut crafted hidden tributes to his queen. Beneath the floors of temples and in the shadows of statues, he left carvings of himself kneeling in homage to Hatshepsut, a dangerous act of reverence in a court where favor could turn fatal overnight. What made this bond so extraordinary wasn't just its defiance of tradition, but its reciprocity. Hatshepsut rewarded Senenmut with unprecedented honors, titles like overseer of all royal works, and the rare privilege of constructing his own tomb near her mortuary temple. Yet their relationship wasn't about transactional loyalty. When Hatshepsut commissioned obelisks at Karnak, it was Senenmut who ensured the granite was flawless. When she needed to legitimize her rule, it was he who helped craft the narrative of divine birth, etching her story into temple walls. Their partnership reshaped Egypt, proving that loyalty could be both a shield and a chisel, protecting the ruler while carving new possibilities into history. But courtly devotion always walked a knife's edge. After Hatshepsut's death, her stepson Thutmose III systematically erased her legacy, defacing monuments and purging records. Senenmut's fate remains a mystery, his tomb unfinished, his name scratched from some walls, yet curiously preserved in others. Some scholars believe this selective destruction hints at a quiet resistance, a network of lesser-known officials who risked their safety to safeguard fragments of Hatshepsut's memory. Because true loyalty doesn't always roar, sometimes it whispers through the cracks of time, leaving just enough evidence to say, "We were here, we believed." Now turn from the grandeur of pharaohs to the humble reed pens of Mesopotamian scribes, where loyalty wasn't etched in stone but pressed into clay. When the library of Ashurbanipal burned, one group of devoted scholars did the unthinkable. They rescued history itself, not with swords but with sweat and cuneiform. The fire was coming. The scribe could smell the smoke curling through the streets of Nineveh as the Babylonian armies closed in, their torches already licking at the edges of the great library. Around him, scholars scrambled to save what they could: gold, jewels, the trappings of power. But one man crouched in the shadows, his hands cradling something far more precious: 12 fragile clay tablets etched with the world's oldest story. The Epic of Gilgamesh wasn't just poetry, it was a mirror held up to humanity itself, a tale of friendship, loss, and the search for meaning written 1,000 years before Homer. As the city burned, this unknown scribe made a choice that would echo across millennia, burying the tablets deep beneath the rubble, where they'd wait like seeds in the desert until another age unearthed them. What kind of loyalty drives a person to risk everything for words? This wasn't a soldier protecting a king or a knight defending a castle. It was a quiet act of devotion to an idea. The scribe knew the invaders would melt down statues and smash temples, but stories were harder to kill. By hiding the tablets, he guaranteed that future generations would hear Gilgamesh's lament for his lost friend Enkidu, his futile quest for immortality, his ultimate acceptance of mortality. These weren't just plot points, they were the first recorded whispers of what it means to be human. and because one man valued them more than his own survival, we can still hear those whispers today. The irony is staggering. The very empire that built the library, the Assyrians, famed for their brutality, became the unwitting guardian of Mesopotamia's greatest literary treasure. When archaeologists excavated Nineveh's ruins in the 19th century, they found the tablets exactly where the scribe had placed them, the cuneiform still crisp despite 25 centuries of silence. Scholars pieced together the epic like a jigsaw puzzle, realizing with awe that they were reading a story older than the pyramids, older than the Code of Hammurabi. That anonymous scribe's loyalty didn't just preserve clay, it preserved a bridge across time. Now, shift from the quiet heroism of preservation to the brutal calculus of war, where one general's loyalty would be tested not by flames but by his own conscience. When the Roman Senate demanded Scipio Africanus betray his principles, his reply would rewrite the definition of devotion. Hannibal Barca's name still sends shivers down spines 2,000 years later, not just because he marched elephants over the Alps, but because he embodied loyalty's most painful paradox. Here was a man who bled for Carthage, outmaneuvering Rome at every turn, only to be betrayed by the very city he swore to protect. After the Battle of Zama, when Carthaginian elders groveled for peace, they offered up Hannibal as a bargaining chip. Exiled, hunted, he could have vanished into history. Instead, he spent the rest of his life one step ahead of Roman assassins, whispering to kings from Syria to Armenia, "Rome must fall." His loyalty wasn't to politicians or palaces, it was to an idea of Carthage that no longer existed. What makes Hannibal's story so haunting isn't his battlefield brilliance, it's the cost of his devotion. Ancient historians like Livy paint him as almost superhuman, a strategist who could read terrain like poetry and turn enemy mistakes into master strokes. Yet for all his genius, he couldn't outwit petty politics. While Roman senators rallied behind Scipio, Carthage leaders starved Hannibal of reinforcements, fearing his fame more than they feared defeat. The bitter irony, his greatest victory at Cannae, where he encircled and annihilated a Roman force twice his size, became the reason for his downfall. The Carthaginian elite didn't want total victory, they wanted manageable conflict. Hannibal's loyalty was too pure, too uncompromising for their calculations. But here's the question that echoes across centuries: when does loyalty become stubbornness? In exile, Hannibal could have retired, written his memoirs, or sworn allegiance to some new kingdom. Instead, he became a ghost haunting Rome's nightmares, advising its enemies until the day he took his own life rather than be captured. His final act, drinking poison from a ring he'd carried for years, wasn't just escape. It was control. Even in death, he denied Rome the satisfaction of breaking him. Modern psychologists might call this goal-derived loyalty, where the cause eclipses the institution. Hannibal didn't serve Carthage's corrupt council, he served the dream of a world where Rome didn't dictate terms. Now, shift from the agony of misplaced devotion to a loyalty so radiant it became legend. In the heart of Constantinople, as plague and fire ravaged the city, one guard stood watch over something far more precious than gold, a promise. They called them the Sacred Band, not because of gods or temples, but because of something far more powerful: love. Picture 150 pairs of warriors, each man bound to his companion not just by duty, but by the deepest affection. The Thebans didn't just recruit soldiers, they crafted an army of soulmates, believing that a man fighting beside his beloved would never retreat, never yield. And for 40 years they were right. At Leuctra they shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. At Tegira they stood against overwhelming odds and won. Their secret wasn't superior weapons or tactics, it was the unspoken promise that every man would rather die than shame himself before the one who knew his heart. The battlefield at Chaeronea tells the story best. When Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander, that Alexander crushed the allied Greek forces, the sacred band refused to flee. They locked shields in one final square, back to back with their partners, until not a single pair was left standing. Ancient historian Plutarch writes that Philip himself wept when he saw their bodies, still intertwined in death. He'd won the battle, but their loyalty had defied him. What's haunting isn't just their sacrifice, it's the quiet intimacy of it. Archaeologists excavating their mass graves centuries later found bones with arms draped over shoulders, fingers interlocked. These weren't just comrades, they were halves of a whole. Modern minds struggle to reconcile their devotion. Was it romance, brotherhood, something beyond labels? The Thebans understood what we often forget: love, in any form, can be the ultimate weapon. Their enemies feared them not for their skill, but for their willingness to do what no ordinary soldier would: die for the person beside them, literally. And here's the twist: their legacy outlived even their destroyers. While Alexander's empire fractured, the legend of the sacred band became immortal. A monument still stands at Chaeronea, a stone lion, its gaze eternal, guarding the bones of men who proved that loyalty, when rooted in love, is the one force even conquest can't erase. Now turn from the roar of battle to the hush of a royal chamber, where loyalty wore not armor but a servant's robe. When kings faltered, one man's quiet devotion would rewrite history's definition of service. A man in chains once changed the fate of an empire. In the sprawling courts of ancient India, where birthright dictated destiny, Chanakya's story defied every convention. Sold into slavery as a child, he carried no family name, no wealth, only a mind sharper than any blade. Legend says he was first noticed in a marketplace, where he corrected a noble's flawed interpretation of sacred texts while still bound in ropes. That moment sparked an improbable journey, from shackles to the right hand of Emperor Chandragupta Maurya, architect of India's first great empire. But here's what history often overlooks: Chanakya's loyalty wasn't given freely. It was earned through a shared vision, a recognition that greatness could rise from the humblest soil. What made their bond unbreakable wasn't servitude, but synergy. Chanakya didn't just serve Chandragupta, he shaped him. The Arthashastra, his treatise on statecraft, wasn't abstract philosophy, it was a playbook for their rise. When invaders threatened the kingdom, it was Chanakya who turned spies into weapons, weaving networks of informants so vast that enemies whispered their secrets into the ears of disguised allies. When drought struck, he reorganized granaries with mathematical precision, ensuring no citizen starved while armies marched. His loyalty manifested not in flattery, but in fearless truth-telling. One famous account describes him rebuking Chandragupta in open court for a reckless decision, his voice steady despite the gasps of onlookers. The emperor's response: he bowed. The brilliance of Chanakya's devotion lay in its reciprocity. Chandragupta, unlike so many rulers, understood that loyalty flows both ways. He granted his former slave advisor authority no Brahmin had ever held, defending him against caste-bound critics. Together, they built an administration so efficient it would inspire governments millennia later. Tax systems balanced to fund expansion without crushing the poor. Trade routes guarded not just by soldiers but by trust. When Chanakya fell gravely ill late in life, the emperor reportedly carried his palanquin through the streets himself, a king acting as a servant to the man who'd made his reign possible. This isn't just a tale of personal triumph. It's a masterclass in how real loyalty, transcends hierarchy. Chanakya could have used his genius for personal gain, playing factions against each other. Instead, he poured every ounce of his intellect into strengthening the throne, because he believed in what it could achieve for the people. His story forces us to ask, Is loyalty measured in obedience or in the courage to build something greater than oneself? Now shift the scene from royal courts to a battlefield where loyalty faced its cruelest test. As dawn broke over the fortress of Masada, a Roman legion prepared to breach the walls, unaware they'd find not defiant warriors, but the haunting silence of a choice no victor could comprehend. The Varangian Guard stood shoulder to shoulder on the crumbling walls of Constantinople, their axes slick with blood, their Norse war cries blending with Greek prayers. These weren't native Byzantines, they were Vikings, sons of Scandinavia who'd sailed thousands of miles to serve an emperor they'd never heard of as children. Yet when the Ottoman cannons breached the Theodosian walls in 1453, they didn't flee to their longships. They locked shields in a final circle around Emperor Constantine XI, their oath binding them tighter than any chain. What makes a man die for a land not his own? The Varangians' loyalty wasn't bought, it was earned. For centuries, Byzantine emperors had entrusted these foreign warriors with their lives, paying them not just in gold but in trust. While local troops might scheme for power, the Varangians had no political ties, no competing loyalties. Their fame spread so wide that sagas back in Iceland sang of their exploits, from guarding palace corridors to crushing rebellions in the Balkans. But their true test came as maimed II's janissaries poured through the breaches. Witnesses later described the Guard fighting back to back, their two-handed axes cleaving through armor, buying precious minutes for civilians to flee. Even as the city burned, their last stand became a bridge between worlds, Norse ferocity meeting Byzantine resilience in a final act of shared defiance. The irony is piercing. These were the descendants of raiders who'd once terrorized Europe, yet here they perished defending Christendom's greatest city. Their loyalty transcended blood and birthplace, proving that devotion isn't inherited, it's chosen. Modern archaeologists still find their relics, a rune-carved gravestone near the Hippodrome, a broken axe head in the harbor silt whispers of men who redefined what it meant to belong. Now turn from the roar of battle to the silent dance of deception, where loyalty wore a mask. In the court of Queen Elizabeth I, one man's web of spies would prove that the sharpest weapon isn't steel, it's information. Bomilcar's name should have been etched in Carthage's history as its savior, yet his greatest act of loyalty demanded he remain invisible. In the shadowy world of spies during the Punic Wars, this Carthaginian operative didn't just gather intelligence, he weaponized deception itself. Picture the scene: Roman generals hunched over maps, convinced their informant had delivered them a golden opportunity, a lightly defended stretch of coastline where Hannibal's forces would be vulnerable. What they didn't know was that every scrap of information Bomilcar leaked had been carefully crafted by Carthage's high command. The trap wasn't just set, it was woven into the fabric of Rome's own arrogance. What makes his story extraordinary isn't the lie itself, but the cost of telling it. Ancient historians like Polybius hint that Bomilcar wasn't just some faceless agent. He'd been captured early in the war, turned by Roman handlers, and even given a new identity. To sell the deception, Carthage had to let its own soldiers die in staged defeats, all to cement his credibility. Imagine the weight of that choice, watching comrades fall, knowing their deaths were the price of making Rome believe. This wasn't loyalty as blind obedience, it was loyalty as a chess grandmaster's sacrifice, trading pawns to protect the king. The climax came in 217 BCE, when Bomilcar's false intelligence lured a Roman fleet into the jaws of a waiting Carthaginian armada. The Battle of Ebro River wasn't just a victory, it was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. By the time Rome realized their trusted source had played them, half their ships were sinking. Yet Bomilcar's reward wasn't statues or songs, it was silence. To preserve his value, Carthage never acknowledged his role, leaving historians to piece together the truth centuries later. Here's the haunting question: can loyalty still count if no one knows your name? Bomilcar's legacy whispers yes. His deception bought Hannibal crucial time to march on Italy, a campaign that would bring Rome to its knees for over a decade. Strategic sacrifice, his story teaches us, isn't about glory, it's about swallowing your own legend for the greater good. Now, shift from the shadows of espionage to the blazing defiance of a queen who refused to bow. When Rome demanded Boudica's submission, her loyalty to her people ignited a fire that would scorch the pages of history. Boudica's story begins with an insult so profound it ignited a kingdom. When Roman soldiers flogged her and assaulted her daughters, a calculated humiliation meant to break Celtic spirit, they underestimated the fire they'd unleashed. This wasn't just a queen wronged, it was a people awakened. Within weeks, Boudica rallied tribes from Norfolk to Wales, her chariot a moving throne of vengeance. What made her loyalty extraordinary wasn't just its ferocity, but its inclusivity. Unlike warlords who fought for personal glory, she wove disparate clans into a single force with a shared cry: better to die free than live enslaved. The rebellion's speed stunned Rome. Camulogenum, Londinium, Verulamium, one after another, her forces reduced Roman settlements to ash. Ancient historians like Tacitus describe her towering figure, red hair like a banner, rallying warriors with a speech that cut to the bone: win this battle or perish. That is what I, a woman, plan to do. Let the men live as slaves if they will. Her loyalty wasn't to bloodline alone, but to the very idea of sovereignty. When her army faced the disciplined legions of Governor Suetonius, they fought not with tactics, but with raw desperation. Even in defeat, her final act, taking poison rather than be paraded through Rome in chains, seared her defiance into history. Here's the paradox that haunts her legacy. Was Boudica loyal to her people or to their right to vengeance? The 60,000 Celts who followed her to their deaths believed the two were inseparable. Modern archaeologists still uncover layers of burnt earth marking her campaign, a grim ledger of loyalty's price. Yet her true impact wasn't territorial, it was psychological. For centuries after, Roman governors hesitated to provoke British tribes, whispering her name like a curse. Now, turn from the smoke of rebellion to the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, where a very different kind of loyalty was being forged. In the courts of medieval Europe, one knight's devotion would become the gold standard for chivalry, not through conquest, but through an oath that outshone even his sword. The sound of Roland's horn still echoes through the valleys of Roncesvalles Pass, a single note torn between defiance and desperation. Surrounded by Saracen warriors, his forces dwindling with every breath, the Frankish knight faced an impossible choice: flee and save himself, or sound the alarm and summon Charlemagne's army, knowing the blast would reveal his position. With bloodied hands, he raised Oliphant to his lips and blew with all his strength, the sound shaking the mountains. His sacrifice wasn't just tactical. It was a declaration that loyalty could be louder than death itself. What makes Roland's last stand so haunting isn't the battle, it's the aftermath. Medieval chronicles describe how Charlemagne's forces arrived too late, finding the bodies of Roland and his companions arranged as if in final formation, their swords still clutched in stiffened hands. The Song of Roland, the epic poem that immortalized him, twists the knife deeper. As his life faded, the knight tried to shatter his legendary sword Durendal against a rock to keep it from enemy hands. When the blade refused to break, he clasped it to his chest like a lover, whispering prayers for his emperor's safety with his last breath. This wasn't just duty, it was devotion sculpted into something almost sacred. But here's the question that lingers like the horn's fading note: was Roland's loyalty wisdom or folly? Some scholars argue his refusal to call for help earlier doomed his men, a martyr complex disguised as heroism. Others counter that his final act wasn't about strategy at all, it was about legacy. By choosing a death that would resonate through centuries, Roland became the beating heart of chivalric code, proof that loyalty could outlast kingdoms. Modern soldiers still visit Roncesvalles, running fingers over the rock where Durendal supposedly left its mark, a silent tribute to the idea that some promises are worth more than survival. Now shift from the clash of steel to the quieter, deadlier battleground of ideas. When the Roman emperor demanded absolute allegiance, one philosopher's refusal would prove that the most dangerous loyalty isn't to power, but to truth. Socrates sipped the hemlock as calmly as a man tasting fine wine. His final lecture delivered not with words, but with silence. Condemned by an Athens that had once celebrated him, the philosopher faced a choice: exile into comfortable obscurity, or death in defense of the very ideals that had doomed him. His loyalty wasn't to the city's shifting whims, but to something far more enduring, the unflinching pursuit of truth. As the poison crept through his veins, his students wept, but Socrates merely adjusted his shroud and kept teaching. "The hour of departure has arrived," he murmured, "and we go our ways, I to die and you to live, which is better, only the gods know." This wasn't stubbornness, it was a masterclass in moral consistency. Athens had accused Socrates of corrupting the youth, but his real crime was exposing uncomfortable truths. Like a surgeon wielding philosophy as his scalpel, he dissected hypocrisy wherever he found it, from pompous politicians to self-proclaimed intellectuals. Even at his trial, when a well-crafted speech might have won acquittal, he refused to flatter the jury. "I would rather die having spoken in my manner," he declared, "than speak in your manner and live." His loyalty to truth was so absolute that it reshaped Western thought itself, proving that ideas could outlast empires. Yet here's the twist that still unsettles us: Socrates didn't consider himself a martyr. In his final hours, he argued that a true philosopher shouldn't fear death, since the soul, not the body, was the seat of wisdom. His calm wasn't bravery in the conventional sense. It was the logical endpoint of a life devoted to reason. Modern scholars still debate whether his execution was a tragic mistake or a perverse gift, the ultimate demonstration of his teachings, because when Athens silenced the man, it immortalized the message. Now shift from philosophy's quiet sacrifice to the roar of a battlefield, where another kind of loyalty faced the ultimate test. When Rome teetered on the brink of collapse, one general would prove that devotion to duty could outshine even the lure of absolute power. Scipio Africanus stood at the pinnacle of power, the dust of Zama still fresh on his sandals, the cheers of Rome ringing in his ears. He had done the impossible, broken Hannibal, saved the Republic, earned the right to demand anything. Yet when the Senate hesitated to grant him a triumph, when whispers of envy coiled through the forum, his response stunned the ancient world. He walked away. Not in bitterness, not as a stunt, but with a quiet certainty that loyalty to Rome meant more than personal glory. His retirement to Liternum wasn't defeat. It was a masterclass in putting the Republic above ego. What makes this act so radical wasn't just the refusal of power, it was the timing. Rome's history brimmed with generals who'd tasted victory and hungered for more. Sulla, Marius, later Caesar. Scipio had every excuse to follow suit. His veterans adored him, his political rivals feared him. The mob would have crowned him if he'd asked. Yet he chose his vineyard over the Palatine, trading the roar of the crowd for the rustle of olive trees. Ancient biographers like Livy paint the scene with aching simplicity. The conqueror of Carthage spending his last years writing memoirs, not marching on the capital. His restraint wasn't weakness, it was loyalty distilled to its purest form. But here's the twist: modern minds often miss. Scipio's humility wasn't naivety. He understood Rome's fragile balance better than anyone. Having seen Greek democracies crumble under strongmen and Eastern empires rot from dynastic squabbles, he recognized that true service meant knowing when to step aside. When prosecutors later hounded him with petty charges, he didn't rally his legions or curse the ingratitude. He simply pointed to the dates carved on his trophies, the days he'd saved Rome, and walked out of the courtroom. His silence spoke louder than any defense. The lesson lingers like twilight over the Tiber. Sometimes loyalty's greatest act is refusal. Scipio could have been dictator, could have been king. Instead, he became something far more enduring, a reminder that the strongest leaders are those who love their country more than their legacy. Now turn from the quiet dignity of retirement to a loyalty so fierce it ignited legend. When a samurai's master fell, his vengeance would rewrite the rules of honor, not with a sword, but with patience that burned colder and deeper than any blade. Beowulf's journey across the Whale Road wasn't just a quest for glory, it was a debt etched in mead hall promises and the silent language of kings. Years before, his father Ecthio had fled a blood feud, finding sanctuary in Hrothgar's golden halls. No treaty demanded repayment, no oath bound the son to the father's obligation. Yet when word reached Geatland of Grendel's nightly butcheries, Beowulf didn't hesitate. He chose the icy currents of the North Sea over comfort, armed not just with sword and shield, but with something far rarer: the weight of inherited honor. The scene in Heorot Hall reveals loyalty's layered brilliance. As Grendel's shadow darkened the doorframe, Beowulf did the unthinkable: he cast aside his weapons. Not from recklessness, but from a deeper understanding of reciprocity. "I shall meet this monster with my hands alone," he declared, "as he uses no sword against our warriors." This wasn't just bravery, it was a poetic mirroring of Hrothgar's own generosity decades earlier. The old king had given Ecthio not just safety, but dignity. Now his son returned the gift in kind, leveling the playing field even against a creature of nightmare. What modern readers often miss is the cultural calculus beneath the heroics. In the world of the sagas, loyalty wasn't linear. It rippled through generations like stones cast into a fjord. When Beowulf ripped Grendel's arm from its socket, he wasn't just saving Danish lives, he was weaving his family's name into the tapestry of legend. The arm, hung from Heorot's rafters, became more than a trophy. It was a receipt, proof that no debt went unpaid. Even Grendel's mother, in her underwater lair, understood this economy of honor. Her vengeance wasn't random. It was the dark echo of the same code that had brought Beowulf across the waves. Yet the poem's true genius lies in its quiet coda. After slaying both monsters, Beowulf refused Hrothgar's offer of the Danish throne. He could have claimed 2 kingdoms that day, his by conquest, his by blood. Instead, he sailed home to Hygelac, his own king, carrying only treasures and tales. The message was clear: loyalty, when pure, seeks no shortcuts to power. Now, shift from the realm of monsters and mead to the delicate dance of diplomacy, where one woman's loyalty would prove mightier than armies. As the Mongol hordes massed at Europe's gates, a princess's letter carried the weight of civilizations. Sukin walked into the heart of chaos with nothing but words as his armor. The Warring States period was an age of blood and betrayal, where 7 kingdoms clashed in endless cycles of vengeance. Yet this unassuming diplomat dared to believe loyalty could wear the face of peace. His mission seemed impossible: unite bitter rivals under a single banner without raising a single sword. Night after night, by flickering lamp light, he studied the art of persuasion until his words could bend kings to his will. The brilliance of his strategy lay in its simplicity. Sukin didn't flatter or threaten, he spoke to self-interest. To the kingdom of Kai, he painted a vision of trade routes flowing like rivers of gold. To the warlords of Chu, he whispered of security against northern raiders. Each ruler heard a different song, yet all harmonized toward one refrain. Together, they could break the wheel of destruction. Ancient records describe how he traveled until his shoes wore through, how he stitched alliances with metaphors sharper than daggers. When 6 kingdoms finally clasped hands in the vertical alliance, it wasn't just a political victory, it was proof that loyalty to humanity could outweigh loyalty to territory. Yet here's the twist that history often overlooks. Sukin's greatest act of devotion came after the alliance crumbled. When his home state of Yan faced annihilation, he didn't rally armies, he staged his own death. Faking defection to the enemy Kai, he spent years eroding their trust from within, deliberately mismanaging campaigns until Yan could strike. Critics called it treachery. His diaries reveal it as sacrifice. "A tongue that saves 1,000 cities," he wrote, "is worth more than 10,000 graves." Now, shift from the eloquence of diplomacy to a loyalty so primal it defied the laws of nature. As Roman legions marched through the Alps, one soldier's devotion would leave even his enemies in awe. Snow bit at their faces like a living thing as the 10,000 stumbled through the Armenian highlands, their sandals wrapped in rags, their shields crusted with ice. These weren't just soldiers, they were men who'd been betrayed twice over, first by the Persian prince who'd hired them, then by the wilderness itself. Yet what makes their march legendary isn't the suffering, it's what they refused to abandon. When the weakest faltered, stronger men carried them. When food ran out, they divided morsels evenly. Xenophon's chronicle reveals the startling truth. This wasn't an army anymore. It was a brotherhood forged in frostbite. The true test came at the mountain past the locals called the Gates of Hell. Blizzards howled with voices like angry gods, and men collapsed mid-step, their bodies vanishing beneath fresh snowdrifts, yet no one was left behind. Soldiers took turns breaking trail, their lungs burning with each breath, knowing the man behind them depended on their footsteps. When Persian envoys later offered safe passage, but only if they surrendered their weapons, the Greeks laughed. Their loyalty wasn't negotiable. Even starving, even freezing, they'd sooner die than betray the trust that bound them together. What's astonishing isn't just that they survived, it's how they thrived. By the time they sighted the Black Sea, shouting, "Thalassa, Thalassa, the sea, they'd become something rare in history, a fighting force that grew stronger through shared hardship. Modern military academies still study their tactics, but the real lesson isn't about formations or logistics. It's about the unbreakable math of devotion, that 10,000 loyal hearts can conquer any distance, any obstacle, as long as they beat as one. Now shift from frozen wastelands to sun-baked deserts, where a different kind of loyalty was being measured, not in miles marched, but in lifetimes served. When Alexander the Great lay dying without an heir, his most trusted general faced a choice that would reshape the ancient world. Ashoka stood on the battlefield of Kalinga, his sandals sinking into mud thick with blood. Around him, the groans of dying men and the stench of burnt flesh painted a scene from nightmares. 100,000 lay dead not by some faceless calamity, but by his own orders. This was the moment his empire reached its zenith, and the moment his heart shattered. What came next would rewrite history, not with more conquests, but with something far more radical, a loyalty so profound it turned a warrior into a monk, a conqueror into a healer. The transformation wasn't instantaneous. Ancient edicts carved into stone pillars tell the story. Ashoka wandered the ravaged land for days, sickened by his own victory. Then came the encounter that changed everything, a Buddhist monk, silent and serene amidst the carnage, offering not condemnation but a single question: who have you truly conquered? That moment cracked Ashoka's worldview open. He realized loyalty to his throne had blinded him to loyalty for life itself. Within months, he traded his sword for scriptures, his armies for missionaries, his expansion for empathy. His famous rock edicts spread across the subcontinent, not boasting of battles won, but proclaiming health care for animals, tolerance for all faiths, and respect for every human life. Critics called it weakness, neighboring kings scoffed at this penitent lion. Yet Ashoka's revolution proved more enduring than any military campaign. By binding his loyalty to Dharma, the moral law, rather than to territory or tribute, he built something unprecedented, an empire where conquest meant not taking land but winning hearts. His officials planted shade trees along roads, built rest houses for travelers, even established the world's first wildlife protections. The same hands that once signed death warrants now funded hospitals for people and animals. The brilliance of Ashoka's choice lay in its honesty. He didn't erase his past, he confronted it. One edict admits his remorse for Kalinga openly. The slaughter, death, and deportation of people is extremely grievous, and weighs heavily on the mind of the beloved of the gods. This vulnerability became his strength. When a ruler acknowledges fault yet still commands respect, it creates a loyalty deeper than fear, a loyalty rooted in shared humanity. Now shift from the heat of Indian plains to the cool marble halls of Byzantium, where loyalty wore a different face entirely. As invaders hammered at the gates, one guardian's devotion would defy time itself, not through change but through unchanging vigilance. Theodosius knew the secret of the Theodosian walls wasn't in their thickness, but in the men who manned them. Among them stood Constantinos, a sentinel whose watch would outlast empires. They called themselves owned ones, yet the Mamluks wielded power that would make kings tremble. Torn from their homelands as boys, these slave soldiers of medieval Islam transformed bondage into a brotherhood that ruled Egypt for 267 years. Their paradox was breathtaking. Men bought and sold, yet fiercely loyal not to masters, but to the code that bound them together. Picture the training grounds of Cairo, where Circassian and Turkic youths honed their skills with a devotion that blurred the line between slavery and sovereignty. They didn't just serve the Sultan, they became him, one after another, in a dynasty where every ruler had once been a purchased child. What made their loyalty so unshakable wasn't blood or birthright, but something far more potent, a shared transformation. The Mamluk system was a forge, melting down identities and reforging them into something new. A boy taken from the Black Sea steppes would spend years mastering Arabic, cavalry tactics, and the intricate hierarchies of the court. By the time he earned his ceremonial saber, his old life was a distant dream. Historian Ibn Khaldun marveled at how thoroughly they internalized their role. They are slaves who behave as kings, and kings who never forget they were slaves. Their allegiance wasn't to a person or even a people, but to the ideal of what they'd collectively become. The ultimate test came in 1260, when the Mongol horde, fresh from sacking Baghdad, turned its gaze toward Cairo. The Mamluks could have bargained, could have fled. Instead, Sultan Qutuz and his general Baybars led a force outnumbered 3-1 into the Sinai dust. At Ain Jalut, they didn't just defeat the Mongols, they shattered the myth of their invincibility. The secret, a loyalty so deep that when Qutuz raised his helmet to drink during battle, exposing his face to arrows, his men surged forward as one to shield him. They weren't protecting a ruler, they were defending the living embodiment of their shared identity. Yet here's the twist that haunts their legacy. The very code that made them invincible on the battlefield doomed them as rulers. Their refusal to pass power to their own children, insisting only purchased, trained Mamluks could lead, created a paradox. Each generation had to prove itself anew, breeding rivalries that eventually fractured their unity. When Napoleon's cannons blew apart their gates in 1798, they fought with the same ferocity as at Ain Jalut, but the world had changed. Their loyalty, once their strength, had become their cage. Now shift from the clash of empires to the quiet power of a pen. As the Mamluk swords fell silent, a different kind of devotion was being etched into parchment, one that would outlast any dynasty. When the Welsh bard Taliesin took up his quill, he wasn't just writing verses, he was stitching a culture back together with ink and memory. Homer's fingers traced the worn strings of his lyre, not as a musician tuning an instrument, but as a sailor feeling for stars in a sightless sky. The poet who gave us Achilles' rage and Odysseus' cunning never saw the faces of the heroes he immortalized, yet his loyalty to their stories shaped history more than any sword. Imagine the weight of that gift, a blind man preserving the memory of those who could see, ensuring the fall of Troy and the wanderings of Ithaca would echo for 3,000 years. The Iliad and Odyssey weren't just entertainment, they were an act of defiance against oblivion, stitched together from fragments of oral tradition before they could vanish like footprints in wet sand. What's astonishing isn't just Homer's endurance sitting through endless retellings, piecing together dialects and contradictions, but his editorial courage. He didn't flatter the Greeks or vilify the Trojans. He showed Hector's nobility alongside Achilles' petulance, weaving a tapestry so human it transcended time. Scholars still debate whether Homer was one man or many, but the truth lies in the work itself. Someone cared enough to polish these tales like gems, knowing their brilliance could outlast empires. Even Alexander the Great slept with the Iliad under his pillow, not as a general studying tactics, but as a mortal yearning to be part of something eternal. This is loyalty distilled to its purest form, not to a person or nation, but to the fragile flame of memory. Without Homer, we might never have known Patroclus' tenderness, Circe's wit, or the ache in Penelope's loom. His legacy asks us a haunting question. What stories would we cross oceans or centuries to save? The ones that comfort, the ones that challenge, or perhaps the ones that remind us greatness and frailty always walk hand in hand. Now shift from the quiet power of poetry to the thunder of revolution. When a peasant monk nailed 95 grievances to a church door, his loyalty to truth would ignite fires no empire could extinguish. Spartacus stood in the dust of the gladiatorial arena, his chains heavier than the sword in his hand. He could have been a champion loyal to the roars of the crowd, the scraps of favor from his masters. But when the iron gate creaked open for what might have been his last fight, he saw something deeper in the eyes of the men beside him. Not fear, but a shared understanding that some bonds outlast shackles. That night in 73 BC, the gladiators didn't just break free from their barracks, they shattered the myth that loyalty must flow upward to those in power. With kitchen knives and stolen weapons, Spartacus turned a desperate escape into a revolution, not for a throne, but for the simplest of dignities, the right to choose. The brilliance of his rebellion lay in its impossible unity. Historians still marvel at how he welded together an army of Thracians, Gauls, Germans, and Syrians, men who'd been pitted against each other for entertainment. Under his leadership, they became something Rome had never faced, a force bound not by nationality or pay, but by the shared memory of whips and chains. Ancient chronicles describe how Spartacus divided spoils equally, how he refused to raid villages that sheltered the poor, how he turned captured Roman camps into schools where former slaves learned to read. This wasn't just warfare, it was a living manifesto, When offered safe passage by Cilician pirates only to be betrayed, he didn't punish his men for the setback. He led them through snow-choked mountain passes, carrying the wounded on makeshift stretchers. Rome's response revealed the depth of their fear. The Senate sent not 1 but 8 legions, more than they'd ever mustered against Hannibal. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, financed the campaign personally. So terrified was the elite of this new loyalty that flowed sideways, not upward. The final battle at the Silarius River was less a clash of armies than a massacre. Spartacus' forces, cornered and starving, fought with the fury of men who knew their fate. Legend says he charged straight for Crassus, determined to strike the head of the beast even if its body crushed him. His corpse was never found. Here's what chills the spine. Spartacus knew he couldn't win. The rebellion's power wasn't in its military success, but in its revelation. For the first time, Rome saw its enslaved not as property, but as men capable of loyalty to each other. The revolt's echoes rippled through history, inspired the Haitian Revolution, fueled abolitionist movements, even whispered through the speeches of civil rights leaders. Because true loyalty isn't always to the hand that feeds you. Sometimes it's to the hands that have bled beside you. Now, step beyond the battlefield into a loyalty so unexpected it defies all categories. When a queen's pet monkey became the guardian of a kingdom's darkest secret, it proved that devotion wears no single face. In the twilight of the Ming dynasty, as rebels stormed the Forbidden City's gates, Empress Zhu made a choice stranger than any chronicle could invent. With her husband dead and her son missing, she entrusted the imperial seal, the very symbol of the mandate of heaven, not to a general or a eunuch, but to her golden-haired macaque, Xingxing. The monkey had been her companion for years, trained to fetch scrolls and mimic court rituals. But what happened next wasn't training, it was something deeper. As smoke choked the palace halls, Xingxing snatched the jade seal in his tiny hands and vanished into the rafters. For weeks, the conquering rebels turned the city upside down searching for the artifact. Meanwhile, the macaque survived on stolen fruit, dodging soldiers and stray cats, until he finally dropped the seal at the feet of a surviving Ming loyalist. Modern historians debate whether the story is fact or folklore, but the message endures. Loyalty isn't bound by species or status. It's a spark that can ignite in the unlikeliest hearts, whether a slave gladiator or a creature deemed mere entertainment. The final act of devotion isn't always grand or even understood. Sometimes it's a monkey in the shadows guarding a broken empire's soul. History remembers kings and conquerors, but empires were built on the backs of unseen believers, the ones who never got songs or statues. Think of the scribe who worked by lamplight copying treaties that would prevent wars, the palace cook who tasted every dish for poison before it reached the emperor's table, or the messenger who ran through enemy lines with lips sealed tighter than tombs. Their loyalty wasn't etched in marble, it was written in ink that faded, whispered in corridors where no one listened, woven into the fabric of daily survival. Take the Roman cubicularii, the emperor's personal attendants. They dressed him, bathed him, knew his secrets, and carried them to the grave. One account tells of a slave who, when tortured by conspirators for information about his master's whereabouts, bit off his own tongue and spat it at his interrogators. No chronicle records his name, or consider the Han dynasty's giant Zun, the palace censors who reviewed thousands of scrolls annually, their sharp eyes catching discrepancies that could expose corruption. Their meticulousness saved provinces from famine by spotting falsified grain reports, yet their tombs, if they had any, lie unmarked. The paradox of their devotion is haunting. The more essential their service, the more invisible they became. Byzantine emperors employed silentiaries, attendants sworn to absolute silence during sensitive meetings. Their loyalty was measured by their ability to become shadows. In Mughal India, Hakkara's spy runners memorized messages verbatim, then destroyed the originals, leaving no trace but their own fragile memories. These weren't fail-safes, they were living, breathing encryption. And then there were the women history barely glimpsed like the Kantharos bearers of Persia, who served wine at royal banquets while discreetly monitoring guests for treasonous whispers. Or the unnamed Celtic druidesses who memorized entire legal codes to advise chieftains, their knowledge so vital yet so deliberately unrecorded that we know them only by the holes they left in the archaeological record. Their loyalty wasn't just to individuals but to systems that outlived them. So here's the question that lingers like incense in an empty temple. Why does anonymity magnify rather than diminish the weight of devotion? Perhaps because these unsung loyalists chose obscurity. They understood that real power often lies in what goes unseen, the stitch that holds the tapestry together from the back, where no admirer will ever notice its color. Now look around your own life. The coworker who fixes mistakes before they reach the boss's desk, the neighbor who quietly shovels your walk during a snowstorm, the friend who listens without ever mentioning it again. These are the modern equivalents of history's invisible pillars. Loyalty doesn't demand a spotlight. Sometimes it thrives brightest in the dark. From Spartans to scribes, these 25 acts of devotion reveal something startling. Loyalty isn't just a virtue. It's the invisible force that shaped civilizations. Think about it, without the Varangian Guard's last stand, Byzantium might have fallen centuries earlier. Without that anonymous Mesopotamian scribe burying Gilgamesh's epic, we'd have lost humanity's first recorded story. These weren't just acts of duty, they were choices that bent the arc of history. But here's what's even more remarkable: loyalty wears countless faces. For the sacred band of Thebes, it was love stronger than death. For Bomilcar, the Carthaginian spy, it meant living a lie so convincing it cost lives. Socrates drank hemlock for truth, while Empress Yu's monkey guarded an empire's soul with its tiny hands. The thread connecting them all, a willingness to stand for something beyond themselves. Now consider this: we often frame loyalty as blind allegiance, but history's greatest examples were anything but. Scipio Africanus walked away from absolute power because his loyalty was to Rome's republic, not his ego. Ashoka abandoned conquest for compassion when he realized true loyalty meant serving all lives, not just his subjects. Even Spartacus, chained and outnumbered, redefined loyalty as solidarity among the oppressed. These stories force us to ask uncomfortable questions. When does loyalty become complicity? When does silence betray the very ideals we claim to uphold? Here's the twist: loyalty's legacy isn't confined to ancient scrolls. It's alive in the modern world. Every whistleblower risking everything to expose corruption, every teacher working late to unlock a student's potential, every caregiver holding a hand in the dark, they're writing new chapters in this unbroken story. The Terracotta army may be frozen in clay, but the spirit it represents still walks among us. So as we close this journey, don't just reflect on these 25 acts. Measure them against your own life. Who or what would you stand unshaken for, not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet moments where no one's watching? That's where loyalty is forged. Drop your answer below and let's keep the conversation going, because history isn't just about looking back. It's about who we choose to be right now. Until next time, remember, the most powerful legacies aren't carved in stone, they're written in choices.